Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Cal Naranya, and welcome to episode 134 of the podcast. A little bit of bookkeeping before we get started with the episode. I wanted to say a huge thank you to Comic Book Nation, to Kofi, Janelle, and Matthew for including me on the podcast. And if you were following along with that, you know I was ill when we recorded that, which is why I was doing such a poor job of promoting that I was going to be on Comic Book Nation. So if you didn't get a chance to check that out, it is on their YouTube link, and I will share it in the show notes for this week's episode. And fun enough, I'm going to be giving more thorough reviews of some of the things I talked about on that show. This week's episode is going to be a little bit different because there are three things I'm talking about. That's the Electric State, Novocaine, and Invincible Season 3. All reviews in this week's episode are going to be spoiler-filled. There is not going to be any no-spoiler segments, as that would just elongate the show to way too long. I'm hoping you watched one of the three things I'm going to be talking about this week, so that's what you can look forward to. You have been warned. Show notes will be listed in the description, which will include time codes. So if you jump around after watching that stuff, you can do that. Let's jump into, why not, a Netflix original with The Electric State.
How'd you two meet?
We actually met in the war.
You're supposed to be killing each other?
We tried. Bots had my whole platoon surrounded, broke my leg in two. 10 men circled up to finish off the job. I look up, I see this big dumb construction bot peering down at me. I close my eyes, get ready to die, and instead he just lifts me up, carries me out.
You were crying like a baby.
Yeah, right. Not like a baby. You know, they don't really know human emotion.
It's really interesting to dive into another Russo brothers movie outside of the MCU. The critical reception in general has not been positive to the projects that they've worked on outside of Marvel. And there's been this conversation of, can they only work in Marvel? And if you're assuming that, unfortunately, you've kind of missed the other stuff that they've worked on, because they were instrumental in Community as well as, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the name of the show, Arrested Development, and that just doesn't seem to be something to be overlooked whatsoever, as well as obviously their work in the MCU. I preferred the Gray Man to what we get in the Electric State, and a lot of that comes from the fact that I'm very curious. Based on what we know about working within Marvel, obviously it is a box. Some people like to use it as a sandbox as the metaphor, and can you play in it, and that there are strict rules and regulations and creative things that you're just not allowed to do. And I think I've come to the realization that while watching the Electric State, and what's most interesting is Marcus and McFeely, the writing team who worked on all of the Russo's films in the MCU, and then as well on Gray Man, is I'm really curious because this film tries to have character relationships and deep, meaningful conversations, but the surface level exploration of those roles doesn't necessarily work when you are introducing new characters from the start. Now, Marcus and McFeely worked on the very first Captain America, so they run through all of his entire runtime, or all of his appearances in the MCU, hold a lot more water against that statement. But I'm really curious as well because, and they'll never say this publicly, and the last thing I ever want to do is be critical of people creatively in effort. That's not what I'm saying. But I would be curious if expectations for something releasing specifically on a Netflix are not expecting as grand or as prestige as, say, perhaps one of the other studios. Now, whether that being HBO or perhaps, actually it's probably only really HBO, or Apple TV Plus, in terms of what are the expectations. And I know people are probably going to be mentioning other films that Apple TV has made that are not great, and of course that is the case. But just in terms of what's been coming out more recently about the expectations of creators working within the streaming service medium, where plots have to be simpled down or dumbed down because they don't expect people to really be paying attention. And my pushback to that would be, if you make something that requires somebody's attention, then they'll pay attention. Expecting the least amount or expecting lower quality out, or not even quality, but whittling down a product or a project. Product is I hate using that word, but whittling down a television series or a movie to the lowest common denominator is something I hate. And specifically, and I will beat this drum till the end of my days, which is when you look at the best quality, well-crafted films for children that also work for wider audiences, they never do that. And then when you are making something that's in that PG-13 realm in the United States that the MCU had such a success with for so long, for the most part, and you can argue some of that is conventional and expected, but when you're doing that with beloved characters, the audience is a lot more forgiving because we love these people and we want to see the journey that they go on through. But what's interesting to me about this is this novel, which I was completely unaware of, as I'm sure a lot of people are. It's unfortunate that this comes out when it does, because I'm not going to say that what it does is wholly unoriginal, but there have been a substantial amount of other projects that do this thing. And similar to something else I'm going to talk about, which I did talk about in Comic Book Nation, this doesn't really seem to have a focus, whether that just be about artificial intelligence and robots being living beings and being considered alive, or it being about people being stuck in a virtual world, or it being about letting go of your loved ones and moving on with your life. That's too many things. And because of that, the electric state is bogged down by only exploring those on a relatively shallow basis, which is quite frustrating. I am also annoyed by the fact that, and this was kind of prevalent in the trailers for this movie, and Chris Pratt has said that this himself, which is, and this is not to say I don't like Chris Pratt. Chris Pratt has had a lot of success in a lot of other projects, whether that be Zero Dark 30, Moneyball, and then obviously Guardians of the Galaxy and Parks and Recreation. But he himself has referred to this character as, what if Star-Lord didn't leave Earth? And that's a massive problem for me, because this character doesn't have any of the traits that are likable from Star-Lord, and that being just his dynamic with, I believe it's Herman, the robot played by Anthony Mackie. Their dynamic back and forth is fun. They're not the focus. They work as you're essentially your Han Solo and your Chewbacca, and they're fine and funny and they're rude to each other. And putting this in the 90s is fine. It's an aesthetic I grew up with, and I love the 90s, and putting this film in that era allows for the technology to have this rudimentary yet more technologically advanced aesthetic to it, which is cool. It's kind of like VHS on steroids. And as somebody who grew up with all of those clamshells, I guess I should explain that. A clamshell, kids, was a plastic case that you folded over your VHS tape to protect it from being damaged. Kind of picture like putting a USB drive inside a flip phone, like the new flip phones. That's kind of the best way that I would describe what that is. That might not even be a good way of describing it, but I mean, we're in 2025, so I wouldn't be surprised if some of my listeners have no idea what I'm talking about. But if you do, I respect you. Not that I don't respect you if you didn't. Obviously, you're born when you're born. That doesn't matter. So the art aesthetic of this is fun, but similar to a lot of Netflix's original films, there is this attempt at grandeur, but whether that be the use of resources, it prevents this from being something that is wholeheartedly special, because we are exploring a world that is not dissimilar from a lot of other ones. The specialness about this just winds up being, for the most part, cameos from brands or trying to interject new fake brands in this movie with the character that is co-played by Chris, and that is fine and all, trying to make like an 80s Rocket Robin Hood kind of style TV show to be the stand-in, who really functions as kind of a bumblebee where he can only make quotes from the show that he was in. And the exploration of what it means to be in this virtual world is introduced as a possibility, and one of the things that the human beings use to overcome this war that they had with the robots, which was all about the ideology of the robots wanting to be more than just servants. And there's a lot to dig into that, but the movie just doesn't. And so the choice to do that allows for Elon Musk-esque character, played by Stanley Tucci, Ethan, is it Skate? It is Skate, to come in and create VR controllable robots, so then people stand a chance at fighting against this robot army. We reach a peace, and they're put essentially in this no man's land in the middle of nowhere. And the parts about the plot that I find kind of humorous is the way that it's stacked together. When we start in the beginning with Millie Bobby Brown's Michelle character and her brother Chris, who's clearly an absolute genius. He's doing some test to get into some university. I believe it's Princeton. And he's clearly very, very smart, and they want him to pursue his genius and see where that will take him. We then are flashed forward quite quickly. Turns out him and his mother and father have died, and Millie Bobby Brown, I believe her name is Michelle, can't get over the fact that they're dead. The movie tries to make it that she's just holding on to her brother. We don't really see any relationship at all that she has with her parents. So obviously I understand sibling love. I have a sister, shout out Haley, who's been on the podcast more than once. And he is this obvious genius. And I'm going to be jumping all over the place because this movie just frustrated me because of it seemingly having no specific idea in mind with what it wanted to be the focus. I actually think it would have been a hell of a lot more interesting if we explored what it actually meant to have this virtual world when the CPU that is holding this whole thing together is Christopher's brain. He has an intellect, and the computing power of the human mind is significantly better, specifically in the 1990s, than anything they were capable of creating at the time. It is an interesting reflection to what's going on with computers now and the use of AI and all these quantum computers and what they are able to come up with through any sorts of data algorithms or generative AI. But that's not what the movie's talking about at all. It's more of a reflection of this particular time period. And Michelle, because she's on her own, kind of winds up going through foster care, and she is looked after by the horrible Jason Alexander, who is also stuck within the virtual world, and she doesn't want anything to do with machines. But what I find so interesting about this is we are not given I don't think a solid enough reason why she doesn't want to be in the virtual world. Her family died in a car accident because of hitting a deer, but then she doesn't want to be in the virtual world because of a reason that I must have missed, but it has nothing to do with the machines. It would have made a lot more sense if Michelle's character was obsessed with the virtual world because of the loss of her family. But that's not what happened, so let's look at what we're happening here. And the journey she goes on meeting Chris Pratt's character and his little robot Chewbacca is all kicked off because Chris somehow is able to escape the cybersecurity that he's trapped into, and he goes into a robot that looks like the cartoon that he liked growing up, and they go on this mission to find him, that he's alive somewhere. Throughout that, we get to see some characters that we've met through. I think what frustrated me more than anything about this movie is, one, there are too many ideas, as I've said, and two, if you just take out some of those ideas, there could have been a really interesting movie in this. And whether that comes down to, and this is not a criticism of the Russos or Marcus and McFeely as screenwriters, but I'm really curious if working within the Marvel machine, which has been dubbed this because of the way that films have been produced under Marvel Studios, that you're not just working independently, that there's a lot more oversight, and it is clear when Kevin Feige, for the most part, is heavily involved in the productions that he was heavily involved in, leads to success. And there's a bunch of different producers listed for this film, and none of them I've heard of before. And I'm really curious if Netflix's methodology when making feature films is just make a film. It is a thing. We're not expecting the audience to be fully ingrained, looking at every intricate detail of the plot and the dialogue. And that's another thing, which is funny enough to me. While watching the movie, I found the dialogue incredibly predictable to the point where sometimes it didn't even make sense where characters went with their dialogue. The relationship between Chris Pratt's character, I believe his name is Keats, and Millie Bobby Brown's character escalates quite quickly, not in a romantic sense, but in terms of friendship, where he is that scoundrel who's just stealing from the zone, selling things off. And you see a lot of amazing 90s merchandise in his stolen thing, his memorabilia cave, which I appreciate. And outside of Giancarlo Esposito just playing a bad guy, and I love Giancarlo Esposito, but even in this where he's just playing bad guy, he's not given enough to do. His character has this heel turn into being a good guy, but there's not really anything there. And the movie's just barely 2 hours long. I actually would be much more interested, and this is such a interesting problem that I have, which is I am interested if this was a longer movie, because there is so much that could be explored. What would this actually look like if it was 2.5 hours long? It could be better. It could be worse. I really don't know. But outside of a bunch of different cameos and some fun robot fighting, the movie doesn't offer anything particularly new or interesting, or a shift on the perspective of story elements that we're familiar with. So it just winds up being a movie. Is it something I'm going to remember? No. Is it the worst thing, though, that I've seen this year? I don't know if that's the case. It's super disposable, which is what a lot of Netflix original movies tend to feel like. So in that sense, it is bad, but it's not a film that I found I was insulted by, which is to say it's a movie. It happened. I watched it. I did have to space it out over 2 hours just because of the way that I consumed it, because of what my schedule looked like. So it's a movie. I don't want to hate on it, but it's definitely nothing I would recommend, nor would I wind up watching again. So that's what I thought about The Electric State. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the film. Now let's jump into another streaming service product, that is Invincible Season 3.
Right about now, Anissa would be telling you how the Viltrum Empire would turn this wretched planet into a utopia. How you would be stupid to resist. I'll tell you no such thing.
All right, if you're a longtime listener of the show, you know that I really like Invincible, and I did quite like Season 2, even though the review system was all messed up because of the fact that it released in 3 parts, and Amazon clearly, and Robert Kirkman clearly learned from that, because that didn't happen with Season 3. We got 8 episodes all in a row, and I really appreciate that. I gave a chunk of my review on Comic Book Nation, and I'm going to reiterate some of the things that I said there, which is I thought this season was kind of focusless. I know Kofi brought up a really interesting point that this season is all about Mark kind of learning how far he can be pushed and when he actually needs to be his dad in terms of what the consequences are going to be for when he is wronged, and that being from a villain because of what happened with Angstrom Levy in Season 2. And I really think he's right when he comes to that being the main focus of this season. However, I still stand by my point that this season, unlike the 2 previous ones, doesn't feel like a season of television. That is a through line, and I'll commend Kofi on that point. I think he's right. But outside of that, there are a substantial amount of events in this season that just feel like, as I said in CBN, comic book annuals that happen to have the main character where the story is just a crazy event and the through line is we're focused on the main character. And a lot of this season is that we have a bunch of random adventures that then culminate with 2 season-ending stories that back to back, I think kind of undercuts what Episode 8, The Conquest War, or whatever it's referred to as. And I know I have a very long message from Scotty Cameron specifically about this season, which I will get to in Question of the Week and Listener Mail. But I found that exhausting, particularly because looking at another Amazon Prime show, which is more interesting just because these shows are on the same platform, and both comics are known for spinning things we're used to or have been inspired by and doing them in their own way, where The Boys is obviously shock and awe, and Invincible is that too, but much more on an animated front, because that is the case with this show. And by the time we get to that, I had to go back through and look to see what events I may have missed with this show. But the lack of focus that made me feeling as if this season was rudderless at times was really disappointing. And that's mainly because as a season of television, I personally feel, and this is my opinion, which is why you're listening to this show to begin with, you need to have some sort of through line to make the season feel cohesive. And when you have each of these random adventures, the only thing really pulling them together at all is Eve, Mark, and oh my goodness, I just forgot the name, Oliver, the name of his brother. And we have Mark going to the future, seeing what he's going to. And a lot of that, and I give a lot of kudos to Matthew and Kofi for pointing this out, which is a lot of this stuff is going to matter. And I understand that I'm sure there's a lot of Easter eggs planted or references that are going to mean something down the road. I don't think that's enough of a justification when they don't matter now. You can have both, but a lot of this season, more than season 2, and it's interesting to me that that's the case where my expectation leading into season 3 from season 2 was we were going to be focusing a hell of a lot more on the Viltrumites coming to Earth. What's Mark going to do? We have the one episode that focuses on Mark's dad being in space. And outside of that, we don't go back to it whatsoever, which I found really weird. So when we have Angstrom Levy show up at the end, or to start season, or oh my goodness, to start episode 7, and you have the Invincible War, which is a whole episode, which easily could be an entire half a season based on everything that happens. That feels more like a finale than it does at all feel like a conclusion or a season finale. As a penultimate episode, it feels almost exhausting, because when we get to the finale with the fight with Conquest, while a lot of that action is super fun, I found myself a little bored just because super strength versus super strength, there did not seem to be enough of the choreography that was shocking or new. Obviously, he's a violent, massive dude, and the fun of it is the fact that Conquest is voiced by Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who, of course, as Negan, brutally murdered Stephen Yeun's, I just forgot, Glenn, character in The Walking Dead. That's the fun of this episode. Yes, I understand that's what they're doing, and that is really cool Easter egg for fans. However, I don't think that's enough to justify this season just having action. And what I find so frustrating more so, and going back to some of the conversations I've had about this season, is the only real difference between season 2's finale and season 3's finale is Mark going, okay, you're right, I have the right to kill people, where you're giving us the same event. And I find it interesting that the point of this finale is to put him through a similar event like season 2. But in this instance, he's saved by Eve, which I don't have a problem with whatsoever. And I loved her going full Jean Grey, Sailor Moon, Green Lantern armor. I thought that was really cool. But with what he goes through in this season, the through line of him not wanting to be his dad, I would have preferred we had more time with Oliver exploring that darkness. We got a little bit of it, and then it kind of just goes away. And the only real thing leading us to, oh, look, Angstrom's back, is the little red eyes, which I'm assuming you're a comic book fan, you know these things are coming. And I had a conversation about this, that if you've read the comics, and this is one of the rare instances where I've not read any of the Invincible comics. My only exposure to this world at all is the show. So like other things I'm going to be reviewing this year, if it works for just the people who are diehard fans, those movies, TV shows, video games, adaptations of a source material aren't gonna work. And I'm not saying that this didn't work. I thought the action for the most part in this season was super cool. I was actually a lot more interested in the B stuff we were dealing with in this because of the fallout of everything we had from season 2 with the Guardians of the Globe, and Rex's death feeling like a real loss because that character's growth that he's gone through when we know who he was like in season 1 was absolutely tragic, and seeing the sadness in the people who have spent time with him. It's a little weird that Rudy changes his name to Rex, and I'm sure that means something because of a Rudy we saw later who was named Rex or wasn't named Rudy. I can't remember. I didn't have time to rewatch all of the season leading up to the finale, just kind of cutting through pieces of it. And I liked this season, but I'm hoping that what I loved about season 1 and season 2 doesn't get lost with 3 from what I've seen and into 4, which is having a season that feels like a bunch of different one-offs that just happen to be almost similar to a lot of movies that were made in the 60s, which was, it was an adaptation of short stories and then just stuck together in long form. Mary Poppins was like that. Jungle Book was like that, where those comics, and we know they've made changes, need to feel a lot more cohesive than feeling as if the only through line is they happen after each other. I don't personally feel that that worked as a season. I'm not saying it was a bad season, but the bar that Invincible has set is quite high. I really like this show, but maybe I'll have a different opinion once the show has concluded its 4th season. I know they're hoping to run for, 8 seasons long. So maybe as the show goes further, as more seasons come out, I will like this season more. But it felt like there was even more setup in this season, and the payoff with Mark really does work as a character change. But I would have really liked to see that be more of the focus than seeming like almost the C story, because each of the events he experiences, I just don't think there's enough. We see Oliver kill the twins. Invincible has to kill, oh my gosh, Immortal. But after that, there's so many events of other random things where some of that doesn't stick together. And at some point, I would like to see Invincible win a fight, not barely dead. Because if he is supposed to stand a chance against a Viltrumite incursion, I just don't know how we're going to see that. And I would like to see a finale that doesn't feel like we're doing a lot of the same of previous ones, because season 3's finale felt like you took parts of 2 or parts of 1 and parts of 2 and jammed them together. And sometimes the PNGs are just so noticeable, and it's really frustrating. Given the fact that this is an Amazon Prime show, please put more money into it, because 2D animation is one of my favorite art forms of all time. I prefer animated things over live action more often. My favorite film of 2023 was Across the Spider-Verse, and my favorite film of 2024 was The Wild Robot. Animation is a beautiful art form, and it should be given production budgets to do so. We shouldn't have PNGs coming past the screen. Just animate them a little. Please, it would be great, and it would elevate this show that is already so highly regarded. I know I'm more negative on this season than a lot of people are, but it's only because I know how great this show can be, and I can see so much of what I love hampered down by some decisions that I just don't necessarily agree with, based on this being a season of television and not just a bunch of individual stories. I know that's not the thought in the majority of people who watch this show, and that's okay, but that's my opinion on Invincible, and I look forward to reading Scotty's opinion of this season as a whole, which I know I mentioned already. So now let's jump into the third thing I'm going to be talking about this week, which is Jack Quaid's new film, Novocaine.
I'm just a regular guy, but I've got this condition. I can't feel pain.
You're a superhero.
No, yeah.
Novocaine starring Jack Hughes is really interesting. What I thought the film was reminiscent of was the 90s Jackie Chan films, not in a way where the martial arts are over choreographed like that, but that the comedy is where the action comes from, and it's in his inability to be physically competent that Nathan Kane, Jack Quaid's character, I said Jack Hughes again, didn't I? I'm a diehard hockey fan, as if you can see any of the clips for this. I'm wearing a Anaheim Ducks hat. That's probably why I said Jack Hughes. But Jack Quaid's Nathan Kane, where he can't feel any pain, which is called SEPA, which apparently is a real autosomal. I can't say any of these words. I don't know why I'm even trying. But that's the character's ability, is to not feel pain. Where you take a character with that ability and you can put him in these crazy scenarios and put him through what would be likely bloody scream, death-curdling, painful moments. And he's able to go through all these things and overcome all the challenges that he's facing with all the things that happen. The plot for this isn't overly complicated, but it's what makes this movie fun is it kind of feels like you took Jim Carrey from Liar Liar and then put him in an action movie. So that blend of comedy and I wouldn't even want to say it's gruesome, but yeah, torture porn, but using it more in the action genre as opposed to just completely disgust you, makes it comical because he can do these things that would be completely impossible for a normal human being to be able to withstand. That's where a lot of the action comes from in this. And you can see this in the trailers where he grabs a iron skillet and uses that as a weapon, or he grabs a gun out of a deep fryer, or he uses things he's already been impaled with as weapons. And it's in that ingenuity that makes this movie not feel completely predictable. The interesting fact about this movie is, and what I found super intriguing based on what I reviewed already with The Electric State, is I really did enjoy seeing this on the big screen, but this is the kind of movie, this really low budget action film, similar to something like Love Hurts, that will do so well once it hits streaming. It didn't have an overly successful weekend, and people are complaining about original films. Something like Mickey 17 didn't do well. This isn't doing well. And it's unfortunate, but we're in that weird part of the year where all the big movies are ramping up and these lower budget ones that don't get the same marketing push. And I think that's something that a lot of people completely underestimate, which is that usually the marketing of a film is at least what the film costs. So an $18 million movie budget likely has an $18 million marketing budget, and that just doesn't get it seen by as many people as those massive studio films. Paramount Pictures, while being one of the tentpole studios, is not the same as a Disney. I mean, Warner Brothers is not what they once were at all, but even Universal, DreamWorks, the other major studios, 20th Century Studios, which is now owned by Disney, the way that they market those things, especially like a Marvel or Star Wars, are just not comparable. So this movie's not being seen by very many people. It also is R-rated, or 18A. I'm not actually sure what the rating was in Canada, as I'm an adult, so I didn't have to worry about that. There obviously is some gruesome violence, and a lot of the humor comes from the things that Nathan puts himself through and how he overtakes all of his different combatants. The plot's not the thing that's the most interesting. I do like the twist that they have on here, where it turns out that Amber Mid-Thunder's character of Sherry was actually an inside quote-unquote person, or inside man, within the bank to find out what the security codes were to get into the vault. And having a small cast like that and having it be fun to play up the different relationships. And obviously Ray Nicholson plays an absolute psychopath in this, and he's wildly entertaining. He's almost cartoonishly bad as the character, not as the performance in the film, and I found that a lot of fun. But this is a smaller budgeted, small movie that, for a brisk hour and a half, does exactly what it's supposed to. I like Jacob Batalon as the quite literally the guy in the chair. And then eventually, of course, he actually does go out on his own feet. And this movie is a lot of fun. There's not a ton to talk about because just to go through every single little action beat in a podcast format, that's not necessarily where the fun is going to be in this. The fun is going on this roller coaster ride with Nathan and seeing how his self-perseverance and what he puts himself through because he's finally found an attachment because of the sheltered life that he's lived his entire life, because of the almost fear-mongering his family put him through because of this disease that he does have, or diagnosis. And everything continually escalates in that sort of die-hard sense where he's just having to overcome the next crazy obstacle. And it's fun to watch him do that. And at times, you want to cringe and close your eyes because it's just utterly disgusting. The one in particular that I did see coming but was still quite enthralling was he uses broken glass as almost claws or brass knuckles, but in this instance, he's using razor-sharp glass to attack this behemoth of a human being. And it's just as horrifying and disgusting as you could probably imagine with that description, but it's fun. And these are the kinds of films that I want to see more of, where it's got a clear, succinct idea for taking the everyman, but quite literally throwing him against the wall metaphorically as well. And I like giving a protagonist who is a meek person and putting him in these extreme circumstances and having the twist be the no pain, or the no pain. That's a terrible sentence. But having Nathan have congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis, or SEPA, makes this unique from other things. This isn't a Nobody or a John Wick or a Monkey Man because it has its own spin and he's not a competent fighter. So there's that level of almost like pool noodle man because of the height of Jack Quaid that makes this entertaining. And he is reminiscent of some people we are familiar with from the 90s, that being a weird amalgamation of Jackie Chan and Jim Carrey. And I commend him for that because that's why this movie works and why I would recommend checking it out. Probably when it hits streaming. I don't know if you need to see it in theaters, but if you are one of those people who says, I need to see new original films, you should definitely check this one out.
Can I ask you a question? Just one?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it.
Last week's question of the week was, what is your favorite Netflix original film? Scotty Cameron writes in, oh boy, my favorite Netflix original movie, in all honesty, I haven't seen a lot of original Netflix films. It might be Army of the Dead just by default. Okay, you know what, Scotty, though? Recommendation. If you like Army of the Dead, you should definitely check out the prequel Army of Thieves. I think I like that one more, and it's really fun to see kind of the origin of one of the main characters from Army of the Dead. Dylan writes in, hello, Dylan, movies to watch before you die, Dylan's Pollock. That makes sense, right? Yeah. Favorite Netflix movie is probably Carry On or Rebel Ridge, although I'm probably forgetting some older ones, but good ones, but it's a lot of crap to find those gems. That is true. Keen Machine writes in, hi, Keen Machine. That's tough. The Knives Out franchise is great. I'll go with that. All right, Stephanie writes in, Always Be My Maybe. Oh, okay. Randall Park and Ali Wong are fantastic, and the music is weirdly amazing as well. That's true. You know what? I think Keen brought out one I probably would have not considered, but I loved Knives Out, and I also really did like Glass Onion. It's interesting that for such a massive studio, that the movies a lot of the time are just kind of fine, which tends to be the case. They don't make a lot of great stuff. Romantic comedies have kind of sort of filled that role on the streaming platform. But yeah, I think a lot of the ones that people have here are ones that are safe to say in that realm. And then Scotty, here we go. I told you I would address this. This has to do with Invincible, so buckle up. Scotty Cameron says, oh boy, I could have a long-form conversation with Kyle about the nature of Invincible, particularly with how the first 3 seasons and the comparisons to the comic. For the sake of shortness, because I know Kyle doesn't like reading a compendium-sized comment, I also don't like buying compendiums, so there's some through line there. I'll try to keep it short and sweet. If Kyle wants more of an elaboration, he can DM me on social media and we can chat. Okay, Scotty. This is the kind of thing I can have a long-form conversation about. Effectively, the first 3 seasons of Invincible are adapting stories from a time when comics weren't written strictly to be collected in trade paperbacks and hardcovers. So there was a lot of self-contained / filler issues of Invincible written from that era. These issues weren't part of any arc. The first season made the smart decision of having a murder mystery with Omni-Man that played out on the dramatic irony and added those scenes to those episodes and would have otherwise been standalone episodes. With the other 2 seasons, there's not really any opportunities to do that. Some of the self-contained episodes come off as filler. It also didn't help that Wolfman, I don't remember. Oh, yeah, okay. Didn't appear until the Invincible War. That's likely because they didn't have permissions from James Howard to use Wolfman until the Invincible War episode, because he has a standalone story prior to the Invincible War that builds Invincible's conflict with Cecil. I can understand why it was cut, because there is no astounding Wolfman show on Prime Video to introduce audiences to Wolfman's enemies and allies who played essential roles in that story. It also continues in Astounding Wolfman's comic. Okay, so without any of that story in the current season, it meant stretching out Powerplex and Multi-Pol Prison Break. That could throw in the next season now that Wolfman has been introduced, but it might not be as impactful, leading to the filler criticism. I hope this wasn't too long. There's a lot I do feel the need to explain. If Kyle wants a more in-depth breakdown, he can slide into my DMs and we can have a more in-depth conversation. Oh boy, I think that's really interesting, Scotty, and this does kind of address what I talked about, which is I'm okay with the one-off episodes, and those work as one-off episodes, but when you're telling a season of television, what's most interesting in the streaming platform is I find those episodes don't work as well as they used to in something where you had 24, 26, sometimes even 20 episodes. But when you only have 8, I found that to be more of a problem than it would have been a benefit in establishing a lot of this stuff that is likely going to be paid off down the run. But thank you to everybody who wrote in for Question of the Week. I really appreciate that. And it's really interesting because we're always getting a wide variety of answers, which makes it really interesting to me. And again, if you didn't watch the thing or don't really have an answer for the Question of the Week, I would love any of the listeners to submit a question and then I can respond to it, because I do love doing that. This week's Question of the Week is going to be controversial, and I know there's going to be some answers that probably say all of these are garbage, and that's totally fine. But this week's Question of the Week is, what is your favorite live-action Disney remake? And the reason for that is because next week's episode of the podcast is going to be a review of the live-action remake of Snow White. So you can look forward to that. To let me know what your answer to the Question of the Week is, you can comment directly below. You can email the podcast, filmreelistspod@gmail.com, or you can @filmreelist on any of the social medias. Just make sure to include the hashtag QOTW. I look forward to your answers and I will react to them next week. If you are a first-time listener of the show and you loved it, please consider giving the podcast a 5-star review on your preferred platform. It helps the podcast grow. I'm trying to get official critic accreditation, which would allow me more opportunities to bring new and amazing things to the podcast. So if you haven't done that and you're a returning listener, please consider doing that, especially if you are a new one. If you've written a review, I will read it live on the show, and I can do that now because we have a new review on Apple Podcasts, who I'm scrolling down to read it now. It says, 5 stars, not just another movie podcast, from Northern Ontarian. I don't know why I read that wrong. Apologies. There are so many movie podcasts. What I really like about Kyle and the guests he has is that I enjoy the podcast even if I haven't seen the movies or the shows. Thank you so much for your review. As I said, I will read them live on the show, and I take any constructive criticism to heart and always try to improve the podcast moving forward. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Kyle Naranya, and I will see you next time.